Muralidharan in the Lok Sabha on Wednesday said that the government's position on China's One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road initiative has been clear and consistent. The government's concerns arise in part from the fact that the inclusion of the so-called illegal China-Pakistan Economic Corridor as a flagship project of OBAR or BRI directly impinges on the issue of sovereignty and territorial integrity of India. This so-called illegal China-Pakistan Economic Corridor passes through parts of the Union territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, which are under illegal occupation of Pakistan. Government has conveyed, its concerns to the Chinese side about their activities in areas illegally occupied by Pakistan in the Union territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, and has asked them to cease such activities. Further, the government is of the firm belief that connectivity initiatives must be based on universally recognized international norms. They must follow principles of openness, transparency and financial responsibility, and must be pursued in a manner that respects sovereignty, equality and territorial integrity of other nations. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will take a closer look at CPEC and India's stand. Joining me on the program today are Lieutenant General P.C. Katoch, retired defense expert, Prabhu Dayal, former ambassador, and Professor Harshvi Pant, head of Strategic Studies, Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, let me begin the program with you. Our stand as far as CPEC is concerned is very consistent. We've always maintained that it is illegal and nothing has really changed as far as CPEC is concerned. Your thoughts?
Well, to be frank, and no pun intended, our stand has always been that the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is being constructed on land that is under illegal occupation, that this land belongs to us. Of course, the Chinese have paid scant regard to all our protests. The Chinese never pay heed to whatever we say, simply because they think that they can override all our protests. Now, there is nothing new in our voicing our concerns. We have done it repeatedly. It is significant that this time it has been done in the Lok Sabha. Now, what is the way out? What is the way forward? I think that the government of India must step up whatever pressure is possible on the Chinese government to make them realize that we are not going to take things lying down. The problem is that the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is already a fact. It exists, and therefore the Chinese or the Pakistanis are not going to be prepared to do anything to do away with it. So we are in a situation where there is a corridor of this sort illegally constructed on land which belongs to us, on territory which is under illegal occupation. But tragically, there is nothing that we are able to do immediately to rectify the situation. Of course, in the longer run, we still think that there will be remedies, but in the immediate future, the least that we can do and the least that we should do is to put as much pressure as possible on the Chinese to make them realize that this has annoyed India greatly, and that we are not at all happy what they are doing, and that we keep the options open for whatever course of action we want to take.
Right.
The problem, of course, is that, as I said, there is very little that we can do to change things in the near future, but we should have a long-term perspective.
Okay, all right. General, are you of the same opinion as well? There's not much that we can do in the short term, but maybe in the medium and the long term, there is something that we can do. And what could those options possibly be?
I will put it this way, that first of all, the entire world knows that the original state of J&K had officially acceded to India. So POK is very much part of India. Now, what the Chinese have done is, they have gone in for the CPEC without reference to India. And not only are they doing the projects there, the PLA is very much based in POK and Pakistan. Pakistan, fine, but POK having Chinese troops without reference to India is actually bad. Now, if the Chinese want India to join the BRI project or the CPEC, the first thing for them should be to agree that POK is part of India. That has got to be the start point. Now, what can India do? Our biggest power is in our markets. But officially, you cannot say that don't buy Chinese products because of the international agreements. But when we are talking of nationalism, what the Indians must do is shun the Chinese products. That is one way to teach them a lesson. As it is, they are making something like $60 billion a year. That is the balance in their favor, the trade balance. Aside from that, the fact is that the Chinese government, because they are drunk on power and the military power and economic power, they have no moralities. As you see today, the 10-cent report is talking of something like 24,589 people killed because of coronavirus and over 1,54,000, but they are telling lies to the entire government and they are working on biowarfare. So it is a country which has gone rogue. But as far as CP is concerned, there are a lot of people in India who say that we should join them. We should definitely not, because it impinges on our sovereignty and our territorial integrity.
All right. Professor, is that an option really to boycott goods from China? What then happens to our economy? Because that's something that we need to consider, and that's something that we need to keep in mind as well when we are dealing with China.
Yes, I think it might be a bit difficult to sort of frame it in those terms, because it will have consequences, and as General pointed out, there are sort of global economic consequences, the WTO and all the rest of it. So how do you frame it in ways that you can show your displeasure, at the same time reduce costs to your own economy, which at the moment needs to be showcased in the best possible manner given the global and domestic slowdown. But I think what is interesting here is on the CPEC question is how China can sort of slitheringly shift from its position where it used to be one of the countries which used to be called sovereignty hawks. And if you go back to the Russia, China, India trilaterals from the 1990s, we have been together. And all the time it was, we were sort of protesting against how the West is encroaching upon the sovereignty issue, and how gradually countries are being forced to give up their sovereignty on various pretexts. And we have been at the vanguard of this. And Chinese used to be the most vociferous of these on this. So suddenly, when it came to India, that principle was put to the wayside. And you had an entire sort of geopolitics and geoeconomics taking over, which has been really at the foundation of what they believe to be an important marker. And we should also realize that recently you have the China-Myanmar economic corridor. So you have that engagement around India, which is trying to encircle India in ways into the Indian Ocean, which has very significant consequences for Indian strategy. So clearly we are looking at a Chinese game plan which is much more than just economics. It is much more about infrastructure, and therefore for us to hold this line on territorial integrity is absolutely a must. I don't see how we can join this project without actually without actually giving up on all the principles that we have stood for so far. So the whole logic of India's Pakistan policy, India's territorial policy goes down the drain if you suddenly say, look, this is something that we need to accept. So I think there is that element, but I must also acknowledge that, if you recall, when it was announced, when BRI was announced, India was perhaps the only country that was challenging it from the day one. And at that point in time, even some of our friends in the West who are now denouncing the same project used to say, no, India should reconsider. So I think by holding the line, India has at least given this message to the world that there have been fundamental problems there. And gradually you have seen the world coming around to India's view, rather than India going around and saying, all right, we should now join in. So clearly there is a shift happening, and India should play up that aspect, how the world is now looking at such projects of Chinese BRI projects, of which CPEC is a very, very important part, in dubious terms, with all the problems that it entails, and the kind of fundamental principles that we have enshrined in our opposition: transparency, bottom-up approach, partnership. Those principles need to be accounted for in the way we go about doing our infrastructure and providing an alternative to what China is providing. And I think that line is very important to hold. So therefore, the fact that it is about territory, the fact that it is about Indian sovereignty needs to be a strong line that we need to be holding very, very strongly.
Sure. Okay. Taking a couple of points forward, Ambassador, this CPEC was supposed to be the answer to Pakistan's economic problems. That was how it was projected, at least when it was started. Do you believe that it has met its goal as far as Pakistan is concerned, or at some level it's going to implode?
I believe quite the opposite. I believe that Pakistan is in a deeper financial mess on account of the CPEC. It has a huge external debt which it has no means of servicing. And actually the Chinese loans to Pakistan have not been fully exposed, but the IMF has grave suspicions about the manner in which the funding of the CPEC has been done. As the General mentioned, there is something about China that really makes it a rogue state, because it's a bully. It does as it pleases, particularly in regard to its neighbors. And I think the time has come to stand up to it. Now, again, the General very rightly said that while it may be not possible for the government of India to boycott Chinese goods, but like him, I also appeal to the individual Indian, the buyer, to refrain from buying anything that is made in China as far as possible. I, for one, if I am buying a product and I see it says made in China, I put it down, I say I want something else. So our policy as buyers, as individuals, should be Indian, buy Indian. I've said this on your channel earlier too. Harsh rightly said that China is in a way encircling us with its string of pearls policy, the CPEC. Its strategies are designed to serve its own interests and imperil ours. And I think we have woken up to China's designs quite some time ago. And we are devising our own counter strategies. If China can have a string of pearls, we have our necklace of diamonds. And we are trying to take care of our strategic interests as best as possible. To come back to Pakistan, this country is shamelessly indebted. It goes around with a begging bowl. And now it only has the Chinese crutch available to it. I don't know what President Trump will give to Pakistan in terms of financial assistance. There are rumors that because he needs them in regard to Afghanistan, he may be prepared to be a little generous. But by and large, it's only China to which Pakistan turns. And Pakistan's indebtedness to the Chinese is becoming a source of global concern. It worries us also, because the Chinese can manipulate the Pakistanis as much as they want to. And because the government of Pakistan has very little levers to pull vis-a-vis China, and it is so indebted to China, it's not able to stand up to Chinese pressure. So this is a very dangerous situation, because China has been using Pakistan as its cat's paw against India. The Chinese protect Pakistan when it comes to shielding it from international criticism relating to its terrorism-related activities. They have gone out of the way to protect Pakistan. And I wouldn't be surprised if they try their best to pull Pakistan out of the grey list of the Financial Action Task Force. So, in return for the sort of protection, for the sort of funding which comes from the Chinese, the Pakistanis are prepared to play along as much as possible. Of course, as they see it, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And there is no doubt in my mind that neither of these two countries, Pakistan or China, has any goodwill towards us. We have seen this time and time again, that when it comes to the crunch, they do not hesitate to hurt India. We have to be very careful of both these countries.
Okay, all right. Be careful of both the countries is what you're suggesting. We're also suggesting that, we should probably boycott Chinese goods, and, that Pakistan really can't stand up to China. But General, on a different note, do we have the wherewithal to take on China?
I'm of the opinion that today's war is largely subconventional. The Chinese are using that. They're using the proxies of Pakistan. They're doing it in the northeast. You look at the United Vast State Army. You look at the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, headed by a Pakistani and working along with the Chinese intelligence. Pakistan is the main problem in stability of South Asia today, and it is backed by China. There is a definite requirement to have a second division of Pakistan, which will also sort out the CPEC unless the Chinese come online, which they are not going to do. So we have to work at the sub-conventional level. Nobody is going to fight our wars. It's not a question of just doing a odd surgical strike or Balakot. There are proxies available on hire. The whole world is doing it. Russia is doing it. Americans are doing it. They're doing it in Afghanistan. They're doing it in Iraq, Syria. Pakistan's ISI is linked with something like 40 regional and international terrorist organizations, and they make their proxies available. They are making them available in Afghanistan, also to the Americans. They made them available in Iraq, Syria. Unless we start fighting this war ourselves, we're going to continue in the same situation. Because even the US and NATO are not fighting classical conventional wars. And if bombings could finish a terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda and ISIS would have been finished long time back. Now that is where we are lacking. And that is where we have to go in. We have to transport the proxy war from Kashmir or from India into the Pakistani territory, which is backed by the Chinese. So then only this country will come to its senses. Otherwise, no question. Otherwise, you can just carry on with diplomacy. That's it. Today, you find that even the Americans don't want Baluchi independence. They are the ones who have banned the Baluch Liberation Army as a terrorist organization. Why don't they want it? If their main contender is China today, and if Baluchistan becomes independent, then even America is at a good situation as far as the Indian Ocean is concerned and the Straits of Hormuz, etc. But they are looking at only their national interests. So unless we start doing this, we could continue in this state of affairs.
Okay, Professor, the General is talking about taking it up a notch, but as far as diplomatic options are concerned, what's in our arsenal?
Well, I think gradually we are, as I mentioned in my previous interjection, gradually India has, we are at a stage where there is diplomatic momentum on our side as far as the larger infrastructure connectivity approach of China is concerned and how the world is looking at it. So if you see, for example, the Partnership for Peace statements, India-Japan, India-US, in fact, EU's entire strategy that has come out on infrastructure is predominantly positively oriented towards the kind of principles that India first enunciated. What tends to happen is that often people, when they look at Indian response, they tend to just look at India's objection on the territorial sovereignty grounds. But India has made a very, very expansive engagement or proposition as far as China's approach to global connectivity is concerned. It has raised certain fundamental principles about sustainability, transparency, the kind of partnership approach that is needed in these approaches against Chinese version of unilateralism. And I think all those principles are now enunciated in the way India is dealing with other countries when it comes to connectivity, and other countries have adopted that approach. So clearly India has an advantage there in terms of shaping the larger normative framework around which alternative models are going to come up. Diplomatically, India has been more robust in our engagement with various countries with whom we share a similar approach, whether it's a larger Indo-Pacific approach, whether you look at it in terms of connectivity, whether India and Japan working together on Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, you have India, Australia, America and Japan coming up with their own infrastructure approach as far as the quadrilateral is concerned. So diplomatically India has moved a notch in terms of articulating a vision which perhaps allows smaller nations, weaker nations to have alternatives, which when China announced its BRI, there was no alternative. It was the only game in town, and therefore the kind of results you found were subpar. And that engagement, I think, has led to some of the problems that we are witnessing, and that unilateralism that China is, as was mentioned earlier, China almost comes out as a very roguish nation, dictating terms to smaller countries, and therefore those countries becoming perpetually trapped in debt, which they are unable to finance, and then you end up in a situation where they are selling their assets to China. So I think that those sorts of conditions emerge where you don't have any alternative, and I think the more India pushes in terms of generating alternative models of infrastructure development, of infrastructure financing, I think that is something that would give great benefits to India, and that in that direction we have seen momentum of Indian diplomacy in the last few years, at least since we became more robust in our offensive against BRI. At that point in time, many had asked, it's very easy to oppose, but what is the alternative? And I think India is now in a position where it can reasonably say that we have now in our kitty some approaches which allow other countries in partnership with third parties to come up with alternative models of infrastructure financing and development, and I think that's something that is worth pursuing. But also in the larger framework, which you are looking at defense and a strategic engagement, you look at India's engagement in the Indo-Pacific, you look at India's engagement with like-minded countries in the region, India's approach, an ambition to become a net security provider, whether in the region or in the larger sort of Indian Ocean, Southeast Asian engagement, or you look at the India's Middle Eastern engagement. I think all of that are in part driven by Chinese growing expansionism and what it does to Indian interests. So I think Indian diplomacy is going in a direction that perhaps is more important today than it was a decade back, when the Chinese influence was not that pervasive. But today you really can't discount China from any part of the world. So if you look at Indian diplomacy, it's time to gear up to that challenge.
Okay, all right. Time now to get closing comments from all my guests with the best way forward, starting first with the Ambassador.
The best way forward is for us not to have anything at all with the CPEC. There are many voices in India, as was mentioned earlier, calling for India to also become a part of the CPEC. My view is that we should have nothing at all to do with the CPEC. It's constructed on land which has been illegally occupied, our land, our territory, and a few economic gains which are possible through the CPEC association pale out in comparison to the insult to us being committed by both China and Pakistan by constructing the CPEC in this fashion. My view is we have had nothing to do with it, and we should keep the CPEC at an arm's length.
Okay, all right. General?
I would say that we tell China that you want us to support one China policy. So how about you supporting one India policy? You first agree that entire Kashmir is part of India. That should be the start point, and then we will discuss with you what we want to do with the CPEC. And if they do not agree, then you go in for the sub-conventional and open your own land route. You let the CPSC carry on, you open a land route through Balochistan to Afghanistan and beyond. And the third thing is, like Indian nationals, stop buying anything which is Chinese.
Okay, all right. And Professor, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
See, I think CPEC is becoming a reality, and India will have to find alternatives to actually increase the costs of Chinese behavior of this kind, which, as China has become powerful, it has become more offensive in the way it approaches smaller nations, including India, which is a bigger country, continental-sized country, and yet China continues to bulldoze a lot of the things when it comes to diplomacy and foreign policy. And I don't think India today is in a position to take it lying down. So we have to come up with alternatives where we can challenge China, and clearly we building internally our strength is a prerequisite, but also at the same time engaging like-minded countries towards building a coalition of countries that can actually deter Chinese behavior of this kind is very important. And I think the way we have shaped the infrastructure connectivity debate over the last decade, over the last few years, since BRI came into being, gives me at least hope that we can shape global narrative in directions which are detrimental to China and beneficial to us, and based on some fundamental principles on which global partnerships are to be based.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests.